Helen sat in the park, staring at a group of tourists chatting fluently in English. She understood them, but when she tried to form a response in her mind, she got stuck. "Why is it so hard to think in English?" She sighed. She had memorized grammar, rules, and vocabulary. But when it came to speaking, her mind still translated everything from her native language. That's when she decided it was time to change her approach. Hey everyone, welcome to English Tone, where we make learning English easy and fun through stories. Have you ever wondered why you struggle to speak fluently? The secret is not just learning English, it's thinking in English. Today, let's follow Helen's journey as she trains her mind to do just that. Helen had always struggled with thinking in English. No matter how hard she tried, her thoughts always formed in her native language first. It was as if her brain had built a barrier, blocking English from flowing naturally. Whenever she wanted to say something, she would first hear the words in her mother tongue, then try to find the right English words. By the time she translated the sentence in her mind, it was often too late to respond. Conversations moved too fast, and she found herself stuck in silence, frustrated at her inability to speak fluently. This problem followed her everywhere. In classrooms, when her teacher asked a question in English, she would quickly understand. It but needed extra time to shape her response. She would mentally construct a sentence in her own language, translate it, then double-check if it sounded right in English. By the time she was ready, the teacher had already moved on to someone else. She felt invisible, as if her thoughts and ideas were locked away, unable to be expressed at the right time. At home, things were no different. Helen often practiced English in front of the mirror, trying to form sentences about her day. She would start with something simple like, "Today I went to the market." But even that took time. The natural instinct to think in her native language first never left her. She would correct herself repeatedly, trying to make her sentences smoother, but the effort exhausted her. It felt unnatural, like forcing a puzzle, piece into the wrong place. One evening, after an embarrassing moment at the grocery store, her frustration grew even stronger. She had seen a foreigner struggling to communicate with the shopkeeper and wanted to help. She knew exactly what to say in her language, but forming it in English became a challenge. By the time she had translated the words in her head, someone else had already stepped in to assist. She walked home feeling defeated, questioning why speaking English was so difficult for her when she had spent years learning it in school. The issue was not that she didn't know English. She could read books, understand conversations, and even write essays. But when it came to spontaneous speech, everything fell apart. The words felt distant, as if they didn't belong to her. It was as though she was a guest in the language rather than a true speaker. Helen decided to talk to her best friend Hira about her struggle. Hira was fluent in English, and Helen admired the way she spoke so effortlessly. She never hesitated, never seemed to pause and translate before speaking. To Helen, it looked like Hira had a special talent, something out of reach. One afternoon, as they sat in a quiet corner of the school library, Helen finally opened up. "Hira, I don't understand why English feels so unnatural to me. I know the words, I know the grammar, but every time I try to speak, I first think in my own language and then translate. It takes so much time. And by the time I'm ready, the moment is gone," she admitted, her voice filled with frustration. Hira listened patiently, a knowing smile on her face. She had heard this struggle from many people before. After a moment of thought, she leaned forward and said, "Helen, stop translating. That's the problem. You're trying to fit English into your native language's structure, and that's slowing you down." Hellen frowned. "But how do I stop?" "It just happens, automatically." Hira nodded in understanding. "I know it feels automatic, but you can train your mind to think in English first. Start small. Describe what you see around you in English. If you're looking at your notebook, don't think of its name in your language and then translate it. Just think, this is my notebook. When you're walking outside, tell yourself, the sky is blue, instead of translating it in your head first. The more you do this, the more natural it will become." Hellen considered this advice. It sounded simple, yet something inside her hesitated. Could she really train her brain to skip the translation step? It seemed impossible, but at the same time, she knew that continuing her current method wasn't helping. As she left the library that day, Hellen made a decision. She would take Hira's advice and make a real effort to stop translating. If there was a way to think directly in English, she would find it. That evening, as she walked home, she looked around and forced herself to name things in English. Instead of thinking about how to say tree in her native language first, she simply whispered to herself, tree. She passed a car and said, a red car. The words felt strange at first, but she reminded herself that this was just the beginning. She knew that changing her way of thinking wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, practice, and patience. But for the first time, she felt hopeful. If Hira could do it, then maybe she could too. It was time to train her brain in a new way, starting with the simplest of thoughts. Hellen took Hira's advice seriously. She knew that if she wanted to speak fluently, she had to break the habit of translating everything in her mind. The problem was that it felt unnatural. Her brain resisted, pulling her back into her native language whenever she tried to think in English. But she had promised herself that she would not give up this time. That evening, as she walked home, she forced herself to focus on the things around her. Instead of allowing her mind to label them in her native language first, she tried to name them directly in English. She looked at the trees lining the street and said softly, tree. She glanced up at the sky and whispered, sky. She saw a bench in the park and reminded herself, bench. At first it felt awkward, almost as if she were fighting against her own thoughts. Her mind kept trying to slip back into old habits, wanting to label the objects in her native language first. But every time she caught herself, she corrected it immediately. It was a slow process, but she knew that even small changes mattered. The next morning, as she got ready for school, she continued her new habit. When she picked up her hairbrush, she thought, hairbrush. When she put on her shoes, she mentally said, shoes. While eating breakfast, she described her actions in English in her mind. I am eating toast. The tea is hot. The sentences were simple, but that didn't matter. The goal was to train her brain to think directly in English without needing to translate first. Throughout the day, she kept pushing herself. While walking to class, she thought, I am walking to school. When she entered the classroom, she observed her surroundings and labeled them silently. The chair is brown. The window is open. The teacher is talking. She felt a strange sense of accomplishment each time she succeeded in thinking in English first. It was as if she were rewiring her brain, little by little. At lunchtime, she sat with Hira and excitedly shared her progress. I tried your method today. I named everything around me in English. At first it was difficult, but it's getting easier. Hira smiled. That's great. The more you do it, the more natural it will. Feel. Soon you won't even realize you're thinking in English. It will just happen automatically. Helen hoped that was true. She still struggled with more complex thoughts, but she reminded herself that she was just beginning. If she kept going, maybe one day she would reach the point where English thoughts flowed as easily as her native language. As she continued practicing, she started forming longer thoughts. Instead of just naming objects, she tried describing them. The book is heavy. The flowers are beautiful. She began constructing small sentences about her surroundings. The sun is shining. The birds are singing. The air is warm. There were moments when she felt frustrated. Sometimes she wanted to express a thought in English, but couldn't find the right words fast enough. Her brain still hesitated, still tried to translate. But she reminded herself that this was part of the process. Learning anything new took time, and retraining her mind to think in a different language was not something that could happen overnight. One evening, while sitting in her room, she decided to take things a step further. She looked around and described everything she saw in full sentences. My desk is small. My notebook is on the desk. My lamp is on. She tried not just to observe, but to think in English as if she were speaking to herself. She imagined telling an invisible friend what she was doing. I am sitting on my bed. I am looking at my books. I am feeling sleepy. The more she did this, the more confident she became. She noticed that words were coming to her more quickly now. She didn't need to pause as often to think. She could form simple sentences without struggling to translate them first. To challenge herself further, she decided to describe her day entirely in English in her mind before going to sleep. She lay down and began recalling everything she had done. I woke up early. I brushed my teeth. I went to school. I talked to Hira. I ate lunch. I came home. I did my homework. At first, her sentences were short and basic, but over time she tried to make them more detailed. I woke up early because I had a lot of homework. I went to school and my teacher gave us a new assignment. I ate lunch with Hira, and we talked about our English practice. She noticed that the more she practiced, the easier it became. There were still times when she struggled, but she was making progress. She felt proud of herself for sticking to her goal. One afternoon, while walking in the park, she realized something amazing. She was thinking in English without even trying. She had been looking at the flowers and, without consciously deciding to, had thought, the flowers are bright yellow. They smell nice. She stopped walking for a moment, surprised. She hadn't planned to think in English. It had just happened naturally. A smile spread across her face. This was exactly what she had been working toward. She ran to find Hira, eager to share her success. Hira, guess what? I just thought in English without translating first. It just happened. Hira laughed. See, I told you. The more you do it, the easier it becomes. Encouraged by her progress, Helen decided to take her practice even further. Instead of just naming objects and describing them, she wanted to start having conversations with herself. If she could practice full conversations in her mind, then maybe one day she would be able to speak fluently without hesitation. She was ready for the next step. Helen had spent weeks training her mind to think in English. She had started small, replacing simple thoughts with English words, naming objects around her, and forcing herself to describe her surroundings without translating. At first it felt unnatural, like forcing herself to walk in a completely new way. But with time, she noticed small changes. Words came to her a little faster, sentences formed in her mind more smoothly. Yet despite this progress, she still hesitated when speaking aloud. She could think in English, but when it was time to say the words, something held her back. The fear of making mistakes, the awkwardness of hearing herself speak, it all created an invisible wall between her and fluency. She knew she had to break through this final barrier, but how? One evening, as she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, an idea struck her. She looked at her reflection and, for the first time, decided to talk to herself in English. It felt strange, even ridiculous, but she reminded herself that no one was watching. This was her moment to practice without fear. Taking a deep breath, she spoke softly. "Helen, what are you doing?" The sound of her own voice in English startled her. It was different from what she had imagined in her head. Still, she continued. "I am brushing my hair." She paused. Had she said it correctly? Was the grammar right? She repeated the sentence a few times, adjusting her tone, making sure it sounded natural. As she spoke, she realized something. Talking to herself like this made her feel more in control of her English. There was no pressure, no one correcting her, no fear of embarrassment. She looked at herself in the mirror again and decided to push further. "What did I do today?" she asked her reflection. She thought for a moment, then replied, "I woke up early. I went to the market. I bought some fruits." The words were simple, but the process felt powerful. She was not just thinking in English. She was now speaking in English, freely and without hesitation. It was like having a conversation with a friend, except that friend was her own reflection. As she continued practicing, she started playing with different tones and expressions. She pretended she was talking to a real person, reacting with surprise, happiness, or curiosity. "Oh, really? That's interesting," she said to herself, smiling. At first, it was all basic sentences. What she was doing, what she planned to do, what she had done earlier in the day. But soon she found herself experimenting. With longer sentences, she started telling stories to herself. One night she stood in front of the mirror and decided to tell herself about something that had happened that day. "You will not believe what happened today," she said, pretending to be excited. "I was walking home, and I saw a cat sitting on top of a car. Suddenly the cat jumped down and landed right in front of me." She laughed at her own story. It felt silly, but it was working. The more she spoke to herself, the more comfortable she became with English. She started using this method in different situations. When she was cooking, she narrated the process, aloud. "Now I am cutting the onions. Next, I will fry them in oil. Oh no, my eyes are burning." When she was doing homework, she explained the concepts to herself as if she were a teacher. "This sentence is in the past tense. The verb here is irregular, so I must change it." Even while walking outside, she would pretend she was talking to a friend. She would imagine conversations, asking and answering questions. "What should I do today?" she asked herself. "Maybe I should go to the park. It is a beautiful day." She started correcting her own mistakes, just like a real conversation partner would. If she said something wrong, she paused and tried again. First, the mistakes made her feel frustrated, but then she realized mistakes were a sign that she was learning. The more she spoke, the more she noticed her own errors, and the more she fixed them. One day, she recorded herself speaking. She wanted to hear what she sounded like. She played back the recording and listened carefully. At first, she cringed at her own voice. It felt strange, unnatural. But the more she listened, the more she realized her English was improving. She was speaking more clearly, with better pronunciation and fewer pauses. Excited by her progress, she decided to take it a step further. Instead of only talking to herself, she would try speaking to real people more often. She knew she wasn't perfect yet, but she also knew that waiting for perfection would only delay her progress. The next day, as she walked into a coffee shop, she took a deep breath and ordered in English without overthinking. "1 black coffee, please," she said confidently. The barista understood her immediately and responded, "Sure. Do you want sugar with that?" For a moment she was caught off guard, but instead of panicking, she responded naturally, "No, thank you." She took her coffee and walked out. A wave of excitement washed over her. She had spoken without translating, without hesitation. That night, as she stood in front of her mirror, she smiled at her reflection. "You did it, Hellen," she said. She had spent so much time talking to herself like a friend, and now, for the first time, she had spoken to a real person with the same confidence. She realized that the next step was clear. It was time to bring English into her everyday life in a more natural and immersive way. Hellen knew that if she wanted to fully immerse herself in English, she had to make it a part of her daily life. Thinking in English was one thing, but she needed to surround herself with it in every possible way. She had spent years studying English in a classroom, learning grammar rules and vocabulary lists, but real fluency required something different. It required making English a natural part of her thoughts, actions, and routines. She decided to start small. The first thing she did was change her phone's language to English. At first, this simple change made her feel slightly disoriented. She was so used to navigating her phone in her native language that seeing everything in English felt unfamiliar. But she reminded herself that this was exactly what she needed: exposure. She forced herself to read and understand the new settings without switching back. Over time, she realized that common phrases and words like settings, notifications, storage, and updates started to feel familiar. She didn't have to translate them in her head anymore. They simply made sense in English. Encouraged by this small success, she took another step. She started watching English movies and TV shows without subtitles. This was much harder than she had expected. The first time she tried, she struggled to keep up. The actors spoke too fast, and she could only catch a few words here and there. Frustration crept in, and for a moment she considered turning the subtitles back on. But then she reminded herself of her goal. Thinking in English meant she had to resist the urge to rely on translation. To make it easier, she chose a simple movie with clear dialogue. She watched carefully, paying attention to body language, facial expressions, and context. At first, she missed a lot of words, but she didn't stop. Instead of trying to understand every single sentence, she focused on the general meaning. Soon, she found that she could guess words based on how they were used. Without even realizing it, she had started thinking in English while watching. She wasn't just translating anymore, she was absorbing the language. She applied this strategy to everything she did. Every morning, instead of writing her to-do list in her native language, she wrote it in English. If she needed to remind herself to buy groceries, she wouldn't write it in translation first. She simply wrote, "Buy eggs, milk, and bread." She forced herself to think directly in English while planning her day. At first, it took more time, but as days passed, it became effortless. English was no longer something she had to force. It was becoming her natural way of thinking. But Hellen didn't stop there. She wanted to take her practice into the real world. She came up with a small game to train her brain. Whenever she was outside, she would describe things around her in English in her mind. If she was walking to the bus stop, she would think, "The street is busy today. There is a man in a blue jacket crossing the road." If she saw a dog, she would think, "That dog looks friendly. It has brown fur and a wagging tail." She didn't just name objects, she described them in full sentences. One day, while sitting in a cafe, she instinctively thought, "Mujhe coffee chahiye." But then she caught herself. She quickly corrected her thought and said in her mind, "I want coffee." This small moment felt like a victory. Her brain was slowly breaking free from translation. She started practicing this game everywhere. When she stood in front of her wardrobe, she thought, "I will wear the blue dress today." While cooking, she narrated to herself, "I am chopping onions. Now I am frying them." At night, before sleeping, she would think about her day in English. "Today was a good day. I learned new words. I watched an English movie. I talked to Hira in English." At first, this kind of practice felt strange, but the more she did it, the more natural it became. She noticed that her reactions were changing, too. When she accidentally spilled water, she didn't think, "Array!" in her native language. Instead, she automatically thought, "Oh no!" This was a sign that her brain was adapting. English was no longer just a foreign language. It was becoming a part of her everyday life. Hira noticed the change in Hellen. One evening, as they walked home together, Hira smiled and said, "Hellen, do you realize how much you've improved?" Hellen looked at her friend, confused. "What do you mean?" Hira laughed. "You just told me about your entire day in English without even thinking about it." Hellen stopped walking for a moment. She replayed the conversation in her head and realized Hira was right. She had spoken fluently, without pausing to translate, without searching for words. The process that had once felt so unnatural was now happening automatically. Excitement bubbled inside her. She was finally thinking in English without forcing it. It had taken time, practice, and patience, but she had done it. But her journey wasn't over yet. Now that she could think in English, she wanted to test herself further. It was time to see if she could speak without hesitation. The afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden glow, and a soft breeze rustled through the trees. Hellen sat on a bench, watching people pass by. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of change for her. Ever since she had started training her mind to think in English, she had felt a shift, subtle at first, but undeniable. She no longer felt the exhausting mental strain of translating every thought before speaking. English was beginning to feel less like a foreign entity and more like something she could claim as her own. The process had not been easy. There were days when she slipped back into old habits, unconsciously forming sentences in her native language, before catching herself. But she had learned to be patient. She reminded herself that change took time, and each small effort brought her closer to fluency. Her daily routine had transformed. Every morning, she described her surroundings in English. She spoke to herself while brushing her hair, while making breakfast, while walking to class. Even when she didn't say the words out loud, she let them form in her mind. The sentences were simple at first, just a few words strung together. But as the days passed, they became more complex, more natural. Hira had been a constant source of encouragement. They often met in the park to talk, practicing conversations entirely in English. At first, Hellen hesitated, struggling to keep up, but Hira was patient. gently correcting mistakes and celebrating small victories. With each conversation, Hellen grew more confident. She no longer panicked when she couldn't find the perfect word. Instead, she found ways to explain herself, using the words she did know. She had also started thinking ahead in English, preparing phrases in her mind before speaking. If she knew she had to order food at a cafe, she would mentally rehearse the conversation beforehand. This trick helped her feel more prepared, more in control. Slowly, English was becoming a language she could navigate without fear. That day in the park, as she sat lost in thought, something unexpected happened. A tourist, a middle-aged man with a backpack slung over his shoulder, approached her. He looked around hesitantly before stopping in front of her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but uncertain. "Do you know where the Greenleaf Hotel is?" For a split second, Hellen felt the familiar instinct to translate his words, to construct a response in her native language first. But something strange happened. There was no pause, no moment of hesitation. The words came to her naturally, as if they had always been there. "Go straight and turn left," she said smoothly. "You will see the hotel on your right." The tourist smiled warmly. "Thank you," he said, nodding before walking away. Hellen sat frozen. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. She had just spoken in English without thinking, without translating, without struggling. It had happened effortlessly. Her heart pounded with excitement. She turned to Hira, who had been sitting beside her the whole time, watching the scene unfold. Hellen's eyes were wide, disbelief and joy written all over her face. "I did it," she whispered. "I thought and spoke in English." Hira laughed, clapping her hands together. "Told you, the more you think in English, the easier it becomes." Hellen let out a breathless laugh, the weight of months of struggle lifting off her shoulders. It had worked. All the practice, all the small exercises, all the moments of frustration, it had all led to this. She had trained her brain to think in English, and now, finally, she could feel the difference. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. Hellen leaned back on the bench, a smile still playing on her lips. She felt lighter, freer. For the first time in her life, English no longer felt like a subject in a textbook or a skill she had to force herself to learn. It felt like a part of her. She knew this was only the beginning. There would still be moments of struggle, words she couldn't find, sentences she had to rephrase. But now, she had proof that she was capable. She had broken through the barrier that once held her back. As she walked home that evening, she repeated the words in her mind. "I did it." They felt good, like a victory she had earned. And she knew that from this moment on, she would never look at English the same way again. She was no longer just learning the language. She was living it. Like Hellen, you can also train your brain to think in English. It might seem difficult at first, but with small, consistent efforts, you will start seeing progress. The key is to immerse yourself in the language and create an environment where English becomes a natural part of your daily life. Many people believe that speaking fluently requires perfect grammar or a vast vocabulary, but the truth is, fluency starts in the mind. If your thoughts are in your native language, your speech will always be delayed by the time it takes to translate. But once you start thinking in English directly, words will flow more naturally and speaking will become easier. The first step is to replace small thoughts with English words. Just as Hellen trained herself to look at a tree and think tree, instead of translating it, you too can start by labeling things around you in English. When you wake up in the morning, instead of thinking about your day in your native language, try saying to yourself, I am waking up. The sun is shining. I need to brush my teeth. These simple statements will help your brain adjust to processing thoughts in English. The more you do this, the more natural it will feel. It might seem awkward at first, but with time, you will notice that English words come to your mind faster, without the need to translate. Another effective method is to have silent conversations with yourself in English. Imagine you are talking to a friend or explaining something to someone. It doesn't have to be complicated. Just practice forming thoughts in English about your day, your plans, or even how you feel. If you make mistakes, don't worry. The goal is not to be perfect, but to build the habit of thinking in English. Over time, your brain will start forming sentences more smoothly, and your confidence will grow. Immersing yourself in English is also an important step. Just like Helen changed her phone settings and started watching movies in English without subtitles, you can create a similar environment for yourself. Surround yourself with English as much as possible. Listen to English music, read simple articles, and try writing your daily thoughts in English. The more exposure you have to the language, the easier it will be to think in it. Even small changes like reading signs or menus in English can make a big difference. One of the best ways to practice is to talk to yourself out loud. It might feel strange at first, but it is an effective way to train your brain. Stand in front of a mirror and describe what you are doing. If you are brushing your hair, say, I am brushing my hair. If you are drinking tea, say, this tea is hot. The more you verbalize your thoughts in English, the more your brain will get used to forming sentences without translation. Even if you are alone, try narrating your actions throughout the day. The key is consistency. Another great method is to ask yourself questions in English and answer them. Imagine you are being interviewed and practice responding naturally. What did you do today? What are your plans for tomorrow? How do you feel? By answering these questions in English, you will train your brain to process thoughts quickly. This will also help in real conversations because you will already be used to thinking in English. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Many learners hesitate to speak because they fear saying something wrong. But mistakes are part of the learning process. Even native speakers make errors sometimes. The important thing is to keep practicing and improving. Fluency does not mean speaking perfectly. It means being able to express your thoughts naturally and comfortably. The more you practice thinking in English, the more confident you will become. Helen's journey was not easy, but she did not give up. She kept practicing every day, even when it felt strange. At first, she struggled, but over time, she noticed a change. Words started coming to her mind faster, and she no longer had to translate before speaking. The real test came when she helped a tourist in the park without hesitation. At that moment, she realized she had finally trained her brain to think in English. You can do the same. Start today. Begin with small steps and stay consistent. The more you practice, the easier it becomes. Thinking in English is a skill that takes time, but with dedication, you will see progress. Just like Helen, you can overcome the habit of translation and start thinking naturally in English. Did you enjoy Helen's story? Let us know in the comments. Have you ever struggled with thinking in English? Share your experience. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to English Tone for more fun stories that make learning English easy and exciting. See you in the next video.